Chapter 1, The Invitation. It was a bitterly cold evening when Julian Archer received the invitation. The envelope, yellowed with age, bore no return address and was sealed with a thick, crimson wax stamp embossed with an unfamiliar symbol, a skeletal hand clutching a serpent. Inside was a single piece of parchment, the ink faded and the edges frayed. You are cordially invited to an exclusive preview of the Draycott Collection at the Hargrave Museum of Antiquities. Midnight. Your attendance is required. Julian, a well-known curator and historian, had heard of the Draycott Collection, a legendary assortment of artifacts rumored to be cursed, though few had ever laid eyes on it. The collection had been acquired by the eccentric and reclusive Lord Hargrave shortly before his untimely death, and it was said to contain relics from across the globe, each one with a dark and twisted history. Intrigued, and with more than a hint of apprehension, Julian decided to attend. The Hargrave Museum, like its namesake, was an imposing structure, a neo-Gothic monstrosity that towered over the surrounding neighborhood. It had been closed to the public for years, ever since Lord Hargrave's death under mysterious circumstances. As Julian approached the museum, the wind howled through the skeletal trees lining the path, and the full moon cast eerie shadows across the building's facade. The wrought iron gates creaked open as if on their own accord, and Julian hesitated, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The museum's grand entrance loomed before him, the heavy oak doors adorned with carvings of grotesque figures. He pushed them open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the dimly lit foyer. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the silence was palpable, broken only by the distant ticking of an unseen clock. A single candle flickered on the reception desk, casting long shadows that danced across the marble floor. There was no one in sight, but a narrow corridor beckoned him deeper into the museum. Julian's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the corridor, the walls closing in around him as the darkness deepened. At the end of the corridor, he found a heavy velvet curtain drawn across a doorway. As he reached out to pull it aside, he felt a sudden gust of cold air and heard a faint whisper, a voice just at the edge of hearing, though the words were indistinguishable. With a deep breath, Julian pulled back the curtain and stepped through, finding himself in a large, circular room. The walls were lined with glass cases, each one containing a relic from the Draycott Collection. The room was dimly lit by a series of candelabras, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move as if alive. At the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, upon which lay an ancient book, its cover bound in cracked, weathered leather. The air around the book seemed to hum with energy, and as Julian approached, he could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. This was the heart of the Draycott Collection, the Codex Maledictus, an infamous grimoire said to contain dark and forbidden knowledge. Julian knew he should leave, that nothing good could come from being in the presence of such an object, but he was drawn to it, as if by some unseen force. He reached out to touch the book, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cover. The moment he made contact, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows along the walls began to twist and writhe. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Julian felt an overwhelming sense of dread. But it was too late. The curse of the Draycott Collection had been awakened. Chapter 2, The Hall of Phantoms. Julian stumbled back from the pedestal, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the room seemed to close in around him. The shadows had taken on a life of their own, swirling like a vortex around the Codex Maledictus. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, each one overlapping the other, creating a discordant symphony of madness. Desperate to escape, Julian turned and fled through a doorway he hadn't noticed before, the darkness swallowing him whole. He found himself in a long, narrow hallway lined with portraits, grim-faced men and women, their eyes following him as he passed. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as the air grew thick with the scent of mildew and rot. As Julian hurried forward, he felt a presence behind him, a cold breath on the back of his neck. He dared not look back, his footsteps echoing ominously in the narrow space. The portraits seemed to leer at him, their painted faces twisting into expressions of malice and spite. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. Julian froze, his heart pounding in his chest, the silence broken only by the faint rustling of something moving in the shadows. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the inky blackness, revealing nothing. But the feeling of being watched persisted, an oppressive weight pressing down on him. He continued down the corridor, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the walls seeming to pulse with a life of their own. After what felt like an eternity, he came upon a door at the end of the hallway. Without thinking, he pushed it open and stumbled into a vast chamber, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The walls were lined with glass cases, each one containing an artifact from the Draycott Collection, a jagged dagger, a tarnished crown, a withered hand encased in glass. Each item radiated a malevolent energy that sent shivers down Julian's spine. At the far end of the room stood a tall, ornate mirror, its surface cloudy and cracked. As Julian approached, he felt an overwhelming urge to look into it, despite the voice in his head screaming for him to turn away. He reached out a trembling hand, his reflection wavering in the distorted glass. The moment his fingers touched the mirror's surface, the glass shattered, and a figure stepped out, an emaciated, ghostly form, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural fire. Julian stumbled back, his scream caught in his throat as the figure moved toward him, its skeletal hand reaching out. The figure was Lord Hargrave, or what was left of him. His once noble features were now twisted in a grotesque mask of suffering, his flesh clinging to his bones like tattered rags. He spoke, his voice a hollow whisper that sent chills down Julian's spine. "You've disturbed the cursed collection," Lord Hargrave rasped. "And now you will join it." Julian tried to flee, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the ghostly figure loomed over him. The room seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating as darkness encroached on the edges of his vision. In the final moments before the darkness consumed him, Julian felt a cold, skeletal hand close around his throat, and then, nothing. Chapter 3, The Chamber of Secrets. Julian awoke to the sound of whispering, the voices surrounding him like a shroud. He was lying on the cold, stone floor of a small chamber, the walls lined with shelves filled with ancient tomes and relics. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something more sinister, a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. He sat up, his head pounding, and realized with a start that he was no longer alone. The room was filled with figures, pale, ghostly forms that hovered just at the edge of his vision. They whispered among themselves, their voices low and conspiratorial, though Julian couldn't make out the words. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, but the figures paid him no mind. They were focused on something else, something that lay at the center of the room. Julian followed their gaze and saw, to his horror, the Codex Maledictus lying open on a pedestal. The book's pages were alive with movement, the ink shifting and writhing as if it were a living thing. Julian felt an overwhelming urge to look away, but he was drawn to the book, just as he had been before. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Julian realized with a jolt that the figures were speaking to him. "Read the words," they hissed. "Unlock the secrets of the Draycott Collection." Julian shook his head, backing away from the book. "No, I can't." But the voices grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, filling his mind with images of horror and despair. The figures moved closer, their ghostly forms pressing in on him, and Julian felt his will begin to crumble. With a trembling hand, he reached out and touched the book. The moment his fingers brushed the pages, the voices stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The room grew colder, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on Julian like a weight. He began to read, the words spilling from his lips in a language he didn't understand. The book seemed to pulse with energy, and as Julian spoke, he felt something stir in the darkness, a presence, ancient and malevolent, that had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The room began to shake, the shelves rattling as the temperature plummeted. The ghostly figures retreated, their forms dissolving into the shadows as the Codex Maledictus began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light. Julian's voice faltered, but the words kept coming, as if they were being pulled from him by some unseen force. The presence in the darkness grew stronger, more tangible, and Julian realized with growing horror that he had made a terrible mistake. The curse of the Draycott Collection had been unleashed. Chapter 4, The Keeper of the Collection. The chamber was in chaos. The shelves had collapsed, ancient tomes and relics scattered across the floor, as the room continued to shake. The glow from the Codex Maledictus intensified, filling the chamber with a blinding light that seared Julian's eyes. He tried to stop reading, but the words continued to pour from his mouth, faster and faster, as if something inside him had taken control. The presence in the darkness grew closer, its malevolent energy pressing down on him like a vice. With a final, desperate effort, Julian wrenched his hand away from the book. The light faded, and the room was plunged into darkness. The shaking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. But it was a silence filled with anticipation, as if the very air was holding its breath. Julian staggered back, his mind reeling from the ordeal. He could feel the presence still lurking in the shadows, watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. But before he could act, a new figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, hooded figure clad in tattered robes. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its face hidden beneath the shadows of its hood. It reached out a skeletal hand, and the Codex Maledictus flew into its grasp, as if drawn by an invisible thread. "You have done well," the figure said, its voice a low, rasping whisper that sent chills down Julian's spine. "The keeper of the collection is pleased." Julian felt a surge of fear as he realized who, or what, he was facing. The keeper of the collection was a legend, a being said to guard the Draycott Collection for all eternity, ensuring that its dark secrets were never revealed. But the legend had also warned of the keeper's wrath, of the terrible price that would be paid by those who dared to tamper with the collection. Julian tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and the words caught in his mouth. The keeper tilted its head, as if studying him, and Julian could feel the weight of its gaze, even though he couldn't see its eyes. "The curse has been awakened," the keeper said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "The collection must be preserved, and you shall take your place among its relics." Before Julian could react, the keeper raised its hand, and the shadows in the room converged on him, wrapping around him like a shroud. He felt his body grow cold, his limbs heavy, as the darkness seeped into his very soul. His vision blurred, and the room began to spin. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the keeper, standing over him, the Codex Maledictus clutched in its bony hand. And then, nothing. Chapter 5, The Final Exhibit. When Julian awoke, he was no longer in the chamber. He was standing in the Hargrave Museum's grand hall, though it was empty and silent, the air thick with an oppressive gloom. The walls were lined with display cases, each one containing a piece of the Draycott Collection. But something was different. The cases were no longer filled with ancient relics and cursed artifacts. Instead, they contained people, figures frozen in time, their faces twisted in expressions of horror and despair. Julian felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he realized that he recognized some of the faces. They were the ghostly figures he had seen in the chamber, the previous victims of the Draycott Collection's curse. He turned, and his blood ran cold as he saw the final display case, the largest of them all. It was empty, except for a single, cracked mirror. And standing before it, reflected in the glass, was Julian himself. He stumbled back, but his reflection remained, trapped within the confines of the mirror. He reached out to touch the glass, but his hand passed through it as if it wasn't there. He was no longer in the grand hall. He was in the mirror, a prisoner of the Draycott Collection. The keeper appeared behind him, its skeletal hand resting on Julian's shoulder. "Welcome to the collection," it whispered, and Julian's scream was swallowed by the darkness as the mirror's surface rippled and then went still. The Hargrave Museum of Antiquities remains closed to this day, the Draycott Collection sealed away, its secrets and its curse hidden from the world. And somewhere within its labyrinthine halls, a new exhibit stands, a cracked mirror, within which lies the final, eternal exhibit, the trapped soul of Julian Archer, the curator who delved too deep into the mysteries of the cursed collection.